terrible. Something stirred in Harry's memory. Greater and more terrible than ever. Professor Trelawney's prediction. Professor Dumbledore yesterday, when I was having my divination exam, Professor Trelawney went very, very strange. Indeed, said Dumbledore. Stranger than usual, you mean? Yes, her voice went all deep, and her eyes rolled in the back of her head, and she said that Voldemort's servant was going to set out to return to him before midnight. She said the servant would help him come back to power. Harry stared up at Dumbledore. And then she sort of became normal again, and she couldn't remember anything that she said. Was she making a real prediction? Dumbledore looked mildly impressed. Do you know, Harry? I think she might have been, he said thoughtfully. Who'd ever thought it? That brings her total of real predictions up to 2. I should offer a pay raise. But, Harry looked at him aghast, how could Dumbledore take this so calmly? But I stopped Sirius and Professor Lupin from killing Pettigrew. That made it my fault if Voldemort came back. It does not, said Dumbledore quietly. Hasn't your experience with the Time Turner taught you anything, Harry? The consequences of our actions are always so complicated, so diverse, that predicting the future is very difficult business indeed. Professor Trelawney, bless her, is living proof of that. You did a very noble thing in saving Pettigrew's life. But if he helps Voldemort back to power, Pettigrew owes his life to you. You have sent Voldemort a deputy who is in your debt. When one wizard saves another wizard's life, it creates such a bond between them. And I'm much mistaken if Voldemort wants to a servant in debt of Harry Potter. I don't want a bond with Pettigrew, said Harry. He betrayed my parents. This is magic at its deepest and most impenetrable, Harry, but trust me, the time may come for you when you will be very glad you saved Peter Pettigrew's life. Harry couldn't imagine when that would be. Dumbledore looked as though he knew what Harry was thinking. I knew your father very well, both at Hogwarts and later, Harry, he said gently. He would have saved Peter, too. I'm sure of it. Harry looked at him. Dumbledore wouldn't laugh. He could tell. Dumbledore. Last night, I thought I was my dad who conjured up my Patronus. I mean, when I saw myself across the lake, I thought I was seeing him. Oh, an easy mistake, said Dumbledore softly. I expect you'll tire of hearing it, but you do look extraordinarily like James, except for the eyes. You have your mother's eyes. Harry shook his head. It was stupid, thinking it was him, he muttered. I mean, I knew he was dead. You think the dead we have loved will ever truly leave us? You think that we don't recall them more clearly than ever in times of great trouble? Your father isn't alive in you, Harry, and shows himself most plainly when you have need of him. How else could you produce that particular Patronus? Prongs rode again last night. It took a moment for Harry to realize what Dumbledore had said. Last night Sirius told me all about how they became animagi, said Dumbledore, smiling. An extraordinary achievement. Not least keeping it quiet from me. And then I remembered the most unusual form your Patronus took when it charged Mr. Malfoy down at your Quidditch match against Ravenclaw. So you did see your father last night, Harry. You found him inside yourself. And Dumbledore left the office, leaving Harry to his very confused thoughts. Nobody at Hogwarts knew the truth of what was happening that night, that Sirius Buckbeak and Pettigrew had vanished, except that Harry, Ron, and Hermione and Professor Dumbledore at the end of the term approached. Harry heard many different theories about what really happened, but none of them came as close to the truth. Malfoy was furious about Buckbeak. He was convinced that Hagrid had found a way of smuggling the hippogriff to safety, and seemed outraged that he and his father had been outwitted by a gamekeeper. Percy Weasley, meanwhile, had much to say on the subject of Sirius' escape. If I manage to get into the Ministry, I'll have a lot of proposals to make on the magical law enforcement, he told the only person who would listen to him, his girlfriend, Penelope. Though the weather was perfect, though the atmosphere was cheerful, though he knew he had achieved a near impossible in helping Sirius to freedom, Harry never approached the end of the school year in worse spirits. He certainly wasn't the only one who was sorry to see Professor Lupin go. The whole of Harry's Defense Against Arts class was miserable about the resignation. "Wonder what they'll give us next year," said Seamus Finnegan gloomily. "Maybe a vampire," suggested Dean Thomas hopefully. It wasn't only Professor Lupin's departure that was weighing on Harry's mind. He couldn't help thinking about Professor Trelawney's prediction. He kept wondering where Pettigrew was now, whether he had sought sanctuary with Voldemort yet. But the thing was lowering Harry's spirits the most was the prospect of returning to the Dursleys. For maybe half an hour, a glorious half an hour, he believed he would be living with Sirius Snape from now on, and his parents' best friend. It would have been the next best thing to having his own father back. And while no news of Sirius was definitely good news, because it meant that he had successfully gone into hiding, Harry couldn't help feeling miserable when he thought of the home he might have had, and the fact that it was now impossible. The exam results came on the last day of our term. Harry, Ron, and Hermione had passed every subject. Harry was amazed that he had gotten through potions, and he had a shrewd suspicion that Dumbledore might have stepped in on Snape failing him on purpose. Snape's behavior towards Harry over the past week had been quite alarming. Harry wouldn't have thought it possible that Snape's dislike for him could increase, but it certainly had. A muscle twitched unpleasantly in the corner of Snape's thin mouth every time he looked at Harry, and he was constantly flexing his fingers as though itching to place them around Harry's throat. Percy got his top-grade newts, and Fred and George had scraped a handful of owls each. Gryffindor House, meanwhile, largely thanks to the spectacular performance in the Quidditch Cup, had won the house championship for the third year running. This meant that the end-of-term feast took place amid decorations of scarlet and gold, and that Gryffindor was the noisiest of the lot. And everybody celebrated. Even Harry managed to forget his journey back to the Dursleys the next day as he ate, drank, talked, and laughed with the rest. As the Hogwarts Express pulled out of the station the next morning, Hermione gave Harry and Ron some surprising news. "I went to see Professor McGonagall this morning, just before breakfast. I've decided to drop Muggle studies." "But you passed your exam with 320%, said Ron. "I know," sighed Hermione, "but I can't stand another year like this one. That time turner. It was driving me mad. I've handed it in. Without a Muggle studies and divination, I'll be able to have a normal schedule again." "I can't still believe you didn't tell us about it," said Ron grumpily. "We're supposed to be your friends." "I promised I wouldn't tell anyone," said Hermione severely. And she looked around at Harry, who was watching Hogwarts disappear from view behind the mountain. 2 whole months before he'd see it again. "Oh, cheer up, Harry," says Hermione sadly. "I'm okay," said Harry quickly, "just thinking about the holidays." "Yeah, I've been thinking about them too, Ron. Harry, you've got to come stay with us. I'll fix it up with Mom and Dad, and then I'll call you. I know how to use the Feli-tone now." "The telephone, Ron," said Hermione. "Honestly, you should take Muggle studies next year." Ron ignored her. "It's the Quidditch World Cup this summer." "How about it, Harry? Come stay, and we'll go see it. Dad can usually get tickets from work." The proposal had the effect of cheering Harry up. "I bet the Dursleys be pleased to let me come, especially after what I did to Aunt Marge." Feeling considerably more cheerful, Harry joined Ron and Hermione in several games of exploding snap, and when with which they had a tea cart arrived, they bought himself a very large lunch, though nothing with chocolate in it. But it was late in the afternoon before the thing that made him truly happy turned up. "Harry," said Hermione suddenly, peering over his shoulder, "what's that thing outside your window?" Harry took a look outside. Something very small and gray was bobbing in and out of sight beyond the glass. He stood up for a better look and saw it. It was a tiny owl carrying a letter that was much too big for it. The owl was so small, in fact, that it kept tumbling over in the air, buffeted this way and that in the train's slipstream. Harry quickly pulled down the window, stretched out his arms, and caught it. It felt very fluffy, like a very fluffy snitch. He brought it carefully inside, and the owl dropped the letter onto Harry's seat and began zooming around the compartment, apparently very pleased with herself for accomplishing the task. Hedwig clicked her beak with a sort of dignified disapproval. Crookshanks sat up in her seat, following the owl with its great yellow eyes. Ron, noticing this, snatched the owl safely out of harm's way. Harry picked up the letter. It was addressed to him. He ripped open the letter. "It's from Sirius." "What?" said Ron and Hermione excitedly. "Read it out loud." "Dear Harry, I hope this finds you before your aunt and uncle. I don't know whether they've used the owl post. Buckbeak and I are hiding. I won't tell you where, in case this falls into the wrong hands. I've had some doubt about that owl's reliability, but he is the best I could find, and he did seem eager for the job. I believe the Dementors are still searching for me, but they haven't a hope of finding me here. I'm planning to allow some muggles to glimpse me soon, a long way from Hogwarts, so that the security on the castle will be lifted. There is something I've never got around to telling you. During the brief meeting, it was I who sent you the firebolt." "Ha!" Hermione said tremblingly. "See? Told you it was from him." "Yes, but he hadn't jinxed it," said Ron. "Ouch!" The tiny owl, now hooting happily in his hand, had nibbled one of his fingers. It seemed to be thinking it in an affectionate way. "Crookshanks took the Order of Owl office for me. I used your name, but told them to take the gold from Gringotts Vault number 711, my own. Please consider it as a 13th birthday's worth of presents from your godfather. I would also like to apologize for the fright I think I gave you the night last year when you left your uncle's house. I had only hoped to get a glimpse of you before starting my journey north, but I think the sight of me alarmed you. I'm enclosing something else for you, which I think you'll make your next year at Hogwarts more enjoyable. If you ever need me, send word. Your owl will find me. I'll write again soon. Sirius." Harry looked eagerly inside the envelope, and there was another piece of parchment there. He read it thoroughly and quickly, and felt suddenly warm and contented, as though he swallowed a bottle of hot butterbeer in one gulp. "I, Sirius Black, Harry's godfather, hereby give him permission to visit Hogsmeade on the weekends." "That'll be good enough for Dumbledore," said Harry happily. He looked back at Sirius's letter. "Hang on, there's a P.S. I thought your friend Maughan might like to keep his owl, and it's my fault he no longer has a rat." Ron's eyes widened. The minute the owl was still hooting excitedly. "Keep him?" he said uncertainly. He looked closely at the owl for a moment. Then to Ron and Hermione, great surprise, he held out him up for Crookshanks to sniff. "What do you reckon?" asked the cat. "Definitely an owl," Crookshanks purred. "That's good enough for me," said Ron happily. "He's mine." Harry read and reread the letter that Sirius all the way back to King's Cross Station. It was still clutched tightly in his hand as he and Ron and Hermione stepped back through the barrier of platform 9 3/4. Harry spotted Uncle Vernon at once. He was standing a good distance from Mr. and Mrs. Weasley, eyeing them suspiciously. When Mrs. Weasley hugged Harry in greeting, the worst suspicions about them seemed confirmed. "I'll call you about the World Cup," Ron yelled after Harry, as Harry bid him and Hermione goodbye, then wheeled the trolley bearing his trunk and Hedwig's cage towards Uncle Vernon, who greeted him with the usual fashion. "What's that?" he snarled, staring at the envelope, still clutching in his hand. If it's another form for me to sign, you've got another. It's not, Harry said cheerfully. It's a letter from my godfather. Godfather? Spluttered Uncle Vernon. You haven't got a godfather. Yes, I have, said Harry brightly. He was my mom and dad's best friend. He's convicted murderer, but he's broken out of wizard prison and now he's on the run. He likes to keep in touch with me, though. Keep up with my news. Check and see if I'm happy. And grinning broadly, he took the horror of Uncle Vernon's face. Harry set off to the station exit, Hedwig rattling along in front of him for what looked like a much better summer than the last.